A billionaire tech mogul slams his cutlery and screams across a fancy restaurant. But then a 21-year-old waitress looks him dead in the eye and says one sentence, and suddenly, the entire room goes silent. What she said next shocked the billionaire and changed both of their lives forever. The clatter of forks stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. The soft jazz that had floated through the five-star restaurant now felt like a distant echo. Everyone turned toward table 7, where a tall man in a tailored navy suit stood, his expression thunderous. "I said this steak is cold," he shouted, slamming his cutlery on the white-clothed table. The sound echoed, sharp and unforgiving. Near him stood a young waitress, barely 21, frozen in place. Her name was Ellie. She held her notepad tightly, her fingers trembling, though she did her best to stay composed. But the fire in her cheeks betrayed her humiliation. This wasn't just any rude customer. This was Richard Vance, the billionaire tech mogul. The same man whose face had recently appeared on the cover of Forbes. He was famous, or infamous, for his brilliance in business and his explosive temper in public. To Richard, this was just another day of demanding perfection. But to Ellie, it was a moment that would change her life. She wasn't just working this job for spending money. Ellie had been pulling double shifts for months, saving every penny for her mother's upcoming surgery. She barely slept, barely ate, but she never complained. Until now. The restaurant manager, watching from the side, hesitated. Should he step in? Apologize? Fire her on the spot? Everyone expected Ellie to break, maybe cry, maybe plead, maybe just walk away. But she didn't. Instead, Ellie slowly looked up at Richard, locking eyes with the billionaire. Her voice, though soft, rang through the stunned silence. "Sir," she said, steadying herself, "I know exactly who you are. But do you know who I am?" The room froze again, this time in a different kind of silence. Shock, curiosity, a hint of respect. Richard blinked, visibly caught off guard. "I'm the girl who's been serving your table for the last 20 minutes with nothing but respect, even though I've been on my feet since 6 in the morning," she continued. "I'm the one who smiled when you ignored me. And yes, your steak is cold, because the kitchen's backed up, not because I'm incompetent." A hush settled over the room like snowfall. Ellie's voice didn't shake. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her calm, firm tone carried more weight than anger ever could. "You may be a billionaire, sir," she said, "but that doesn't give you the right to treat people like they're beneath you." That one sentence, that one moment, froze the entire restaurant. Even Richard Vance, who had shouted at CEOs and fired entire departments without blinking, was now silent. Something had shifted in the air, and no one in that room would forget what came next. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Every eye was fixed on Ellie, the young waitress who had just spoken to a billionaire like he was anyone else. Even Richard Vance, the man known for chewing out executives in boardrooms and firing people mid-meeting, was stunned. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He was used to apologies, not defiance. Ellie didn't flinch. She straightened her back, her voice calm and unwavering, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "You walked in here expecting to be treated like royalty," she said. "And you were. You got the best table. You got service the moment you walked in. But the second your steak wasn't perfect, you decided I was the problem." The air in the room grew heavier, like a storm was about to hit. Diners stopped pretending to eat. Phones were recording. Even the kitchen staff had stepped out, silently watching from the doorway. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Watch how you speak to me," he muttered, almost as a reflex. But Ellie didn't back down. She stepped slightly closer, not in aggression but with confidence. "No, sir," she said. "You watch how you speak to people. I'm not here to be yelled at. I'm here to work, just like you once were." The words hit harder than a slap. For a moment, something flickered in Richard's eyes. A memory, maybe. A flash of something he hadn't felt in years, humility. But Ellie wasn't finished. You think money gives you power, she continued, but real power is how you treat people who have nothing to offer you. Right now, you're showing the world exactly who you are. And it's not impressive. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no bitterness, just raw honesty. And that's what made it hit so hard. A few guests began nodding quietly. One man muttered, "Good for her." Another whispered, "About time someone said it." Richard's hands slowly lowered from the table. He looked at her again, this time really looked at her. Not as a waitress, not as someone beneath him, but as a person. He leaned back in his chair, the anger fading from his face. It was replaced by something unexpected: shame. "My mother," he said softly, almost to himself, "worked at a diner." The entire room leaned in. "She raised me and my brother on tips. Wore the same shoes until they fell apart. And she used to come home crying after customers treated her like—" He trailed off. His voice cracked just slightly. Ellie didn't respond with sympathy or forgiveness. She simply said, "Then maybe you should remember how she felt before you treat someone else the same way." And just like that, the room froze again. Not because a billionaire had been humbled, but because a young waitress had reminded everyone that respect is earned not by wealth, but by humanity. The once booming billionaire now sat quietly, his bravado stripped away by a single sentence from a girl half his age. The restaurant was still. You could hear the hum of the ceiling fan, the faint rattle of dishes from the kitchen, but no one dared move. The man who had just moments ago demanded attention now looked small. Richard Vance, the tech mogul worth billions, was staring down at his untouched steak like it held all the answers to the past 20 years of his life. "I haven't thought about her in a long time," he said, not looking at Ellie, but not ignoring her either. "My mom." The words came slowly, like they were being pulled from a locked place deep inside him. "She worked in a diner outside Boston. Graveyard shifts. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Then she'd come home, make us breakfast, sleep 3 hours, and do it again." Ellie stood silently, arms at her side. She didn't interrupt. She didn't soften. She let him speak. "She used to cry when no one was watching. Pretended to be strong for me and my brother. But I saw it. I saw what people did to her, how they treated her like she didn't matter." His voice faltered. "And I promised her. I swore I'd make it big, so she'd never have to serve another table again." There was a pause, not the awkward kind, but the heavy kind. The kind where a person realizes they've become everything they once despised. Richard looked up. For the first time, his gaze wasn't sharp or commanding. It was tired, worn. "And yet here I am," he said, almost in disbelief, "doing exactly what those people did to her." Ellie nodded slowly. "You just forgot," she said gently. "That's what happens when success makes too much noise. It drowns out where you came from." The honesty of her words hung in the air like thick smoke. Richard leaned back, his shoulders sinking. The powerful man was gone. In his place sat a son, remembering the pain of his mother, remembering who he was before private jets, before headlines, before he became untouchable. "You know," he said, eyes misty, "she passed away 2 years ago. I bought her a house, gave her everything, but I never gave her respect when it counted." It was the first time anyone in that room had seen Richard Vance as human. Not a mogul, not a monster, but a man caught between two versions of himself. And standing across from him was Ellie, a girl he'd tried to dismiss, now holding up a mirror to his soul. No one spoke. Not the manager. Not the guests. Not even Ellie. Because everyone knew, in that moment, something inside Richard Vance had changed. And the next thing he would do would leave the entire restaurant speechless once again. For a moment, everything stood still. Richard Vance, once roaring with entitlement, now sat slouched, shoulders heavy, eyes distant. Across from him, Ellie stood tall, not with arrogance but with quiet strength. Then, like a match struck in the dark, someone clapped. It was soft at first, a single pair of hands breaking the silence. Then another joined. then 3. And suddenly, the entire restaurant erupted in applause. Not the polite, awkward kind people give after a speech. This was real, raw, the kind that came from witnessing something human, a confrontation that cracked the mask of wealth, power, and ego. A man at the corner table wiped a tear and stood. "That was beautiful," he murmured. A woman in a business suit turned to Ellie and said, "You spoke for every service worker who's ever been silenced." Even the bartender, who had been watching quietly behind the counter, nodded and gave Ellie a small thumbs up. Ellie stood frozen, her hands still clutching the notepad. She had expected to get fired, maybe escorted out, but instead, she was being treated like a hero. The restaurant manager finally stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Everyone braced for him to say something corporate, something that would break the moment. But instead, he placed a hand gently on Ellie's shoulder and said, "Take the rest of the night off, with full pay. You've earned it." The crowd applauded again. Then, without warning, Richard stood up. He turned to face the room, to face the people who had once looked at him with fear, now watching him with cautious curiosity. He raised a hand. The room quieted again. "I've made a lot of deals in my life," he began, his voice steadier now, "some worth billions. But tonight, I witnessed something far more valuable than any contract or company." He paused, then looked directly at Ellie. "I saw courage. I saw truth. And I saw the version of myself I promised I'd never become, until tonight reminded me." His gaze turned back to the room. "I apologize. To Ellie. To everyone here. I was wrong, and I'm not too proud to admit it." There was another beat of silence. Then Richard did something no one expected. He reached into his coat, pulled out a gold business card, and handed it to Ellie. "I want you to come work with me," he said. "Not as a waitress, but as someone who clearly understands people better than most of my boardroom." The entire restaurant gasped. Ellie stared at the card like it might vanish. "You don't have to decide now," Richard added. "But I meant what I said. You reminded me who I was." And with that, he turned, nodded to the manager, and walked out, quietly, without fanfare. For a man who once demanded attention, tonight, he left behind something far greater. Respect. The night Ellie stood up to a billionaire was one she would never forget. But what came next changed her life forever. The next morning, as the sun poured into her tiny apartment, Ellie's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, thinking it might be a scam. But something nudged her to answer. "Hi, is this Ellie Matthews?" a professional voice asked. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Julia from the office of Mr. Richard Vance. He asked me to reach out personally. He'd like to offer you a full scholarship to complete your studies and a paid internship at his foundation, starting immediately." Ellie froze. "This isn't a prank, right?" she whispered. "No, ma'am. And one more thing. Your mother's pending surgery expenses? Mr. Vance said he's already covered them in full." Ellie dropped into the nearest chair, hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, not from stress this time, but from the sheer weight of relief. That afternoon, the news broke online. Someone from the restaurant had uploaded the full confrontation. The video went viral. Millions watched as a young waitress stood up to power and won. Hashtag Waitress versus Billionaire started trending. Ellie's inbox flooded with messages, people thanking her for saying what they always wanted to. Interviews, podcasts, even college students reached out to tell her she was an inspiration. But the story didn't stop there. A week later, Richard Vance returned to the same restaurant, not to dine, but to publicly apologize again. This time, cameras were invited. He stood at the front, with Ellie beside him. "I forgot where I came from," he said to the press. "This young woman reminded me, with grace and courage, that no one is above decency." He then announced the launch of the Ellie Initiative, a $5 million fund to provide health care and scholarships to hospitality workers across the country. He named it after her, without her even asking. Ellie took the mic, her voice still humble. I didn't do anything special, she said. I just spoke the truth. I didn't plan to change anyone's life. I only wanted to remind someone that people like me matter too. But the world disagreed and rewarded her for it. Within months, Ellie had enrolled in business school, working part-time with Richard's foundation. She helped design programs for underprivileged youth, something she'd always dreamed of. Her mother recovered fully, and now proudly told anyone who'd listen, "My daughter made a billionaire change his heart." And as for Richard Vance, he stayed true to his word. He stepped back from several boards and began speaking publicly about ethical leadership, often using that night in the restaurant as his turning point. Because sometimes it takes just one sentence, spoken at the right moment, to rewrite someone's entire story. And that sentence? Sir, I know exactly who you are. But do you know who I am? Sometimes it's not fame, money, or power that leaves the biggest impact. It's one voice, speaking truth in the face of arrogance. And that night, Ellie's voice reminded the world, and a billionaire, that real power is kindness and real strength is courage. If this story moved you, drop a red heart in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because more inspiring stories are on the way.